just to clarify, we're going to cover what it is, where it is, what the impacts are likely to be, and how it's being managed currently. So we do have many questions that are asked of us every time we go on sites with ash dieback. How did it get here, and what is the nature of this pathogenic disease, this fungus, and how's it getting from tree to tree? How do we know whether you've got it? Well, in what the symptoms are, we'll cover some of that, and what makes the tree dangerous and or it's a higher risk, and then how quickly will it progress in this location or that location, and then what do you do when you've got it, and what is the required timeline, and the risks in terms of what that risk is in terms of both time and also what the indicators are that it's a high risk. And more importantly, for Somerset Wildlife Trust, what are the ecological impacts going to be? And of course, these are significant. And how are we going to deal with that loss, and where we will go to make sure that we have more resilient woods and habitats. And in the final analysis, how can we all help, or what is the best way to help in this circumstance? Okay, so to give you a bit of background, the actual outlook for trees or ash trees in the UK has sort of been significantly reduced due to recent studies. We've taken the number of trees that are going to die up to 120 million. Now, of course, that does have an impact on our tree coverage, and also impacts on our ability to manage other factors like canopy cover and carbon. So understanding the impact is, you've got to understand ash first, and where it is, and how many there are in the country. It isn't like really the previous largest outbreak of a tree disease, which was that was Dutch elm disease. And Dutch elm disease affected trees over a longer period and spread probably slightly slower than ash dieback is, because it wasn't windborne. It had a beetle vector, so it could get places via the beetle. But the actual trees themselves, even if they were dead, they were still safe. But this is not the case with ash. Even though with elm, obviously, the majority of trees died, with ash dieback, we're still getting very high mortality rates, so up to 90%. But it can be more dependent whether it's a woodland or out in the country, a lone ash tree. There is a very small percentage of trees which actually can resist this, and I'll go through that later on. And it is going to be in scale, 6 times worse than the Dutch elm disease sort of tree health crisis. So we're going to see significant impacts right across our landscapes. And of course, not just across landscapes, but across habitats, with thousands of species being affected, including, these dependent species or obligate species. So what is it? Well, it is a fungus, in fact. It's a pathogenic fungus. Now, it is the main reason why the trees die, and it's the infection of the tree which triggers this process of, in the actual fungus itself producing the sort of metabolites, which is when it's actually just living, and it produces a toxin called viridiol. And that viridiol is effectively a phytotoxin, which means it kills the tissues of the tree, and it means that if it gets into the leaves, it tends to spread down, and more viridiol gets produced, and then that's what the dieback is. It's the death of that tissue, and therefore the actual living sprouting parts of the tree then die back. Now, obviously the fungus is not disturbed by this, and actually it can make it part of its actual life cycle. So these tree leaves and rachis, which is the middle bit of the leaf, the midrib, actually falls to the ground and then produces fungal bodies which can actually produce more spores and infect more trees. So it produces potentially millions and millions of spores, which can then lead to more infections. So it came across from the east. So we're not absolutely sure of what particular vehicle or location it started at, but we do know it was first reported in Poland. And it's spread out from that location into the Baltic states, and it progressed into Germany by 2002. So in that sort of 12 years, it had spread significant distance, hundreds of kilometers. And it's primarily as I said earlier on in the text, it's due to the fact that human beings are moving a lot of wood products, and also they're moving nursery stock around. So what happened with the UK is that we actually, to save money, would send our seeds abroad to be germinated and then turned into small trees to be planted in woodland. This ended in those trees or saplings being infected with ash dieback, and then they were brought back to this country, bringing the disease with them. There is still a possibility that it was windblown as well within this area. From right across the North Sea, there are some areas that suggest that it infected trees on the periphery, on the coastline. So the reason why our ash is particularly affected is because it hasn't grown or co-evolved with this fungus, unlike the Manchurian ash, which is actually co-evolved. So if we go to the Far East, then you would still see Hymenocipus fraxineus, but it would not affect the trees in the same way because they've co-evolved. So we know what the fungus is, we know it's pathogenic, we know that it can kill up to 90% of the trees. Now, how many trees do we have and where are they? Now, this is a map of the UK, obviously, mostly England, showing the density of ash, so with the darker areas being a higher percentage of ash. Now, this is from a sample, so there may be some error in it, but it is very obvious where the high density areas are in the East Midlands and actually down into Cornwall. It is very common in the east of England and some of the other wildlife trusts, such as Kent and Buckinghamshire, and up into Suffolk, have actually been quite badly affected, and it has some, obviously here is indicated in the actual numbers of trees that are in that location. So we're looking at sort of an unbalanced picture. The progression of disease is in certain areas, which I'll show you in a minute, but what has happened is that some areas that didn't get it until much later have a much more accelerated profile in terms of the effects of the disease. So it is probably many, many factors which are causing this. And that is called a web of causality. So this is our most recent Forestry Commission map of where the disease is. And as you can see from the coloration, the disease started out in the east of England and spread right across to the west. But there are some areas which leapfrogs others where the material, such as this nursery stock, was brought in from Germany. And we can see that they started out quite early. And if you can see down here, you can see that that was 2014 in East Mendip. So that was quite early on in the outbreak. So that means that that area is far more severely affected currently as compared to other places which are even further east. I think that it's important to note that it isn't just the case of the material arriving and then causing the problem. It is a result of other factors, and particularly, as I've said here, it's the drought years which can cause an acceleration of that problem. So I think you may have all seen this. I mean, this is quite a common picture, seeing ash dieback as the withered leaves and the blackened leaves. That is one of the primary kind of ways to spot this disease, is to see the black leaves on the ground, stained leaves that have been dropped early. Usually they senesce, grow old very quickly, very early in the season, because the spores are active at that point and are actually infecting the leaves and causing this necrosis or death. The other sign is the diamond-shaped lesions, which you'll get on the twigs, which you can just about see here. This is in this area here, and it's particularly pronounced on these, which is a bit too far away to see, but you can see that this light brown coloration, this sort of tan coloration, is pretty typical of actual dieback on stems. The other signs, now, this is a more sort of a larger scale because it's the whole tree. So this particular tree, this poor tree that was in a hedgerow in Harwich, has been affected, significantly and for a long time by being adjacent to an affected woodland. So the spore count in that location was significantly higher, but because you can see that is not a healthy tree, it's lost a lot of its smaller branches. And this is an extreme version of what ash dieback does. But if we look in the woodland picture below, you can see earlier signs, but this is still round about halfway through the process of dieback. So you can see certain crowns are very thin, or there's more leaves in the center of the crown, but overall they're very sparse. So it is the percentage of the leaves, which gives us the key indication as to how far this disease has gone. And it's actually through the outline of the tree. And now a normal ash tree will have a smoother outline. So if you see a rougher crown, then that's an indication too. A particularly sinister, or at least difficult to spot issue is looking at the stem bases of ash trees. You might find this lighter coloured area, a triangular area right at the base of the tree, and that is a basal lesion. And that's an indication that there's an awful lot more ash dieback and a lot more spores active in that area. So progression is down to many factors, and as I said before, like a web of causality. So there's lots of other issues going on. So they've got the pathogen. It's not just the pathogen, it's the environment. And in Mendip particularly, we have the shallower soils on a limestone, which is well drained, and it's impoverished in terms of its fertility. So in a drought year, the trees are already stressed. And of course, that can lead to vulnerabilities and open up the trees to other diseases, or if there is a disease present, then that can cause further decline. So when we look at the tree, as I've said, how many leaves there are, that gives us an idea of how healthy that tree is. And we would, on average, expect it to decline by sort of 15 to 20%. However, we have seen trees in Mendip actually go down by 30%. So this is all due to our climate changing, or at least the weather patterns changing. And that's down to sort of lower rainfall leading to vulnerabilities. So in terms of how many trees may die, it does vary by site. Even though we've said that's 85 to 90%, it probably is somewhere in that region on average, but they can be higher in woodlands. But this is the most recent figures we have. But I would say that Mendip is much more severe than this. I would say that Mendip is 90%, but on average in other woodlands with deeper soils and different conditions, that it'd be closer to the 70%. But in plantations, now that's a different matter again, because that's genetic. That's a genetic lack of variability. They're very much a monoculture. So those more recent plantations are all one genetic stock from these Eastern European sources or from the UK. So they are more vulnerable and more likely to die. And again, we have a high percentage of ash in the Mendip, so we're going to get much more effects and a higher spore count. So the resistance, this is something that obviously we need to be aware of, because we are looking to hopefully get trees which will survive this pandemic, this tree pandemic. And there is a suggestion that we have some markers, we understand the disease in terms of what it's made out of. So perhaps we can then look to the future in decades to find trees which are resistant and maybe base a program on that. But it is a very long process, and it is something that we've only just begun. And it is something that if you compared it with, say, something like Dutch elm disease, we're only really getting some good elm trees, resistant elm trees now after 30 or 40 years. So hopefully that whole process will be accelerated. But we do need to be keeping an eye out for these trees which can resist the disease. But it is something that we're only just starting, so that we can go into this natural selection or breeding programs. This is going really more onto the risk side, but it is important. So it's showing what the other effects of the actual diseased tree may feel or be impacted by. So it isn't just the actual fungal pathogen that is the problem. It is the other sort of elements or pathogens within that environment which may cause the tree to decline and die. And particularly in the case of ash, where ash trees are, there is a very high likelihood that you'll get armillaria or honey fungus, which is a really aggressive pathogen, and a pathogenic fungus which can also go into active sites within the roots of the trees, left vacant by mycelium or by the mycorrhiza, which have died because the tree is no longer producing the carbon that's required to keep that, that sort of fungal hyphae alive. So therefore, as an active site that an armillaria can come in and take over the roots, decay the roots, and lead to root failure, which we can see on the right-hand side. So the fungal fruiting body that is there, that's why it's called honey fungus. It's that lovely sort of golden honey colour. But it is something to keep an eye on, because it does lead to whole tree failure, and that's something we've experienced in Cheddar, particularly in Blackrock. This picture here with a star-shaped sort of staining, that's actually the infection from the spores going into these bodies within this sort of channel that comes from the outside of the tree into the center. They're called a lenticell. And that has led to this death or necrosis here, which is now decaying. And these black lines are just where the fungus is fighting it out to decay the tree. What are the risks? Well, this fellow here who's underneath this tree is blissfully unaware of being under an ash tree, and certainly one that's sort of dying back there. But we, as tree managers, or anybody who is managing trees, and particularly ash trees, we need to be looking out for when the trees have only 50% of the leaves that we would expect. And that is when things become more hazardous, because we are looking at a decline in both the health of the tree and also the structural integrity of the tree, which leads to an embrittling, a kind of when you get dead ash, it's much more snappy, so you're more likely to get a limb fall away or the tree to snap in unpredictable ways. And that's particularly true of the root plate, as we've seen in the previous photos. And basal lesions, as I've said, are a bit of a higher risk of failure as well, particularly if you're looking at roadside trees which are loaded on one side. So this is the official national guidance on how to look at an ash tree, and what percentage crown are we looking at, and what does it look like? Well, we can see that that's a healthy ash, nice smooth outer canopy. And they'll be quite rare now, I think, in our area anyway. We won't see many of these, but if you do, then that's most likely a resistant ash. And then we're looking at sort of the progression down into what is, death, basically. It's a mortality spiral where it loses more leaves, means it has less energy, it has less ability to fight and to produce the carbon required to keep its relationships with these mycorrhizal fungi, which can then mean that it has less resources to fight. So, and as that declines beyond the 50% decline of the canopy, that is when this particular diagram here shows you that the actual risk climbs significantly. And we find that we can't actually work on these trees in a normal way. We have to find particular techniques. So what are we doing is Somerset Wildlife Trust. Removing trees is the answer in the right places. So where we have higher risks, we'd want to undertake tree removal. But as you can see from this photo, actually removing the people from the risk may be the best way to avoid having to do significant work which is damaging to the habitat. Now, obviously, the trees are dying or are dead, so therefore the habitat is in decline. But if we go in with machinery that would be required to do safe operations, that could lead to further damage and expense that may not be warranted or justified. But monolithing or reducing the ash to a much smaller, woody structure, which means we can keep some of those benefits that the tree has in particular areas where the risk is high. But what is favoured in this is sort of unused areas or areas where people are not actually walking or present, then no interventions may be the best for this. Actually going into a woodland and proactively felling ash trees before they are below 50% is still being done, but it's not as desirable as managing the periphery and the edges and those bits of the woodland where human beings are. That's much more of a focus for us. So as I said, we're felling because of the increased risk, and it's better to fell them in particular locations before they fall down, because they are going to fall down. So in terms of our going through the process of managing these habitats, we know that we can remove them safely, or we can wait for them to fall down unsafely. So we're better off removing them before that risk becomes too high. And there is quite a few areas where that has had to be done. The risk is obviously too high beside roads, beside buildings, beside footpaths, or by bridleways, particularly in Cheddar. So, we need to focus on those areas, and not all the trees will be felled. We will try to retain as much as possible so that there's a softer transition from existing woodlands, allowing scrub and regeneration to come through. So what does it mean for you as the public and volunteers? Well, it means that effectively we are going to have extensive areas which will be felled. Unfortunately, it is inevitable that you know, areas will need to be managed more proactively than we would want to. This isn't the focus or the drive of SWT to remove trees, but obviously as part of sound management, we need to manage these trees for safety and for also for possibly for replacement and for rebuilding these habitats. It does mean that there'll be less ability for the public to access these reserves in certain reserves. Not all reserves are affected as badly, so our more westerly reserves have got ash, but maybe don't have the high percentage of ash that we have on the Mendips. And of course, when you're driving around, people that you know, you will probably be affected by, you know, traffic lights, traffic management. It'll happen all the way across. All of the landowners will have this problem, and all road users will have this problem. It is not something that obviously any of the landowners want, but and it is a very expensive part of the process, is managing you know, on the highway safely. And it is extended to footpaths as well, where closures will need to happen during works, or they might be needing to be closed and diverted just to prevent that risk being imposed on walkers and to allow people to safely enjoy the countryside. And there will still be obviously many dead trees in the less accessible areas. So the scale of works will, as I say, be very high. There will be many areas affected, and particularly it'll be the Mendips, because we have a very high percentage of ash in these woodlands, particularly in Cheddar and across the Harwich. And it is at that landscape scale that we'll need to think about how we go forward. But with the urgency of how much risk is imposed, particularly say in Cheddar, if you're walking into the woods around Cheddar, or we were walking into near maybe to Batscombe or up in Blackrock, you know, these areas are very high value to the local community. But of course, you know, we have to think about safety first. It is safety first across the estate, and we would never want to exclude anybody from these reserves, but it is inevitable that, you know, these trees are becoming very unpredictable in their likelihood of failure. They're climbing to the point where it is unacceptable to impose this risk on walkers or users of the, you know, the woodland. So in essence, you will see a lot more exclusions. It's certainly for the, you know, for maybe a year, if not two, just whilst this process is completed. It is urgent that we manage these woods and these trees, particularly, as I say, in these target areas. But it does mean a huge unplanned cost to the trust. It is significant beyond even multi-year budgets. And as I've said here, we've budgeted for 600,000. However, we anticipate that to be much greater in the final analysis. The final figure will be much higher, and it will be over multiple years. It could carry on for 3 to 5 years, the managing of woodland. I mean, our emergency works currently are, you know, are significant, but that is only really the high profile areas and the areas that are accessible. We will still have the legacy of ash dieback for many years to come. It could be as long as a decade. So how are we doing this, and what is the reason for using certain techniques? Now, as I mentioned, embrittlement is a problem with the trees becoming more and more unsafe. And by being unsafe, we have tried other methods, and across the country there have been various experiences with the sort of failures of trees and unpredictable failures. So there have been 4 deaths, recorded deaths, that might well be connected to ash dieback, and there have been many more near misses with climbers. When you're climbing a tree to take the tree down, the actual rope that you put in the tree goes over an anchor point. We've had many anchor points in ash trees fail, and where, you know, people have been using normal methods and safe methods to climb the tree, but they still fail. So this is part of what we need to take into account, why we'll be using more machines to actually remove these trees, particularly those trees that are below 50% canopy. And it is difficult to fell trees directly. You can't fell them from the ground using a chainsaw as traditional methods would dictate. It is too dangerous, because the trees, because of this deterioration in the fibre length, if you try and fell a tree using a hinge, the hinge can break apart and the tree can fall unpredictably, or actually that we've been known to split right up the entire length of the stem, killing anybody who would be nearby to that. So we obviously would prefer to do it in a safe way. So we're using machines, and many more machines will be seen in the woodlands removing these trees. So we do have ash trees in many of the reserves, but as I said, particularly across Harwich and right across the Mendips, which are particularly affected because of that underlying soil and rock. They will be focused. We will just only do them where we need to do them initially. And these are the reserves that are particularly affected: Edford, Harwich, Blackrock and Longwood. You know, these are the reserves that we've tried to focus our efforts on because they have the highest footfall and would have the biggest impact if there was a failure. So ash dieback, in terms of timeline, this is just an average. This is actually the national body which is responsible for the response for ash dieback, which is the Tree Council. So the Tree Council have pretty much said that, you know, you need to start planning early. Now, of course, that's not been given, you know, the possibility of getting in early, but because we have been, we've had a deterioration which has been much quicker than expected. So in fact, instead of being at this action plan stage here, we are further down the line on the back end of the planning stage, and we are now deep into the actual action stage of that. Now you'll see that there's a red line here called awareness. That awareness is both within the organisation and outside the organisation in the community, and that includes all of you. You know, we all need to be aware of what the impacts of ash dieback is and why we might be doing works. It's obviously not going to be something that we would want to do, but it is necessary. And knowing that we are deep in the action part of this process, we obviously need to accelerate our kind of efforts to make everybody aware. So as part of that, obviously this is talk, but there's also on top of that, I will be happy, you know, to answer questions afterwards, just so that we can clarify and you know, manage you know, any conception of how this might play out. So there are different trees in different locations and are affected slightly differently. I won't sort of labour the points on it, but it is important to note that they do provide different benefits, and non-woodland ash trees, such as, you know, hedge trees, as you can see from the picture in the right hand side here, you know, that was providing a great deal of benefit in terms of, you know, height and scale and the habitats themselves that were within that tree. In essence, I think that, you know, non-woodland ash trees have more chance of surviving, given the statistics and the sensitivity of the actual fungal spores to UV. It's likely we will get some individual trees in these locations that will survive, but where we lose them, we're losing incredible linear features. And we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at a sort of future resilience and also the replacement of these trees. And we do need to think about what we put back. So hopefully we'll have some resistant saplings, and we'll encourage those and plant those as part of a process of getting ash back into the landscape, but we'll need to think about other tree species which are suitable and getting them from the right locations. So again, going back to the sort of impacts on Mendip, as you can see from these, you can actually see the trees that have died back, and to the left here you can see this is Blackrock. These trees have now been managed and removed, not all of them, but all of those trees which are on that roadside or nearby to the roadside have been removed. So we are looking at the dramatic change in the landscape. So it's around about 90% of those trees will be gone in as little as 5 years. So tree management in terms of, you know,
the sound's gone off.
Yeah, sorry, Ian, we've lost your sound.
Yeah, so have I.
Still can't hear you, I'm afraid, Ian. Do you want to try, like, I'm going to mute you and unmute you. No, I'm afraid we've not got you. Have you got a like a headphone or something that you could plug in? We just lost you all of a sudden. Still not got you, Ian. No, nothing. Okay, right. If you log off and log back in again, maybe. Sorry about this, everyone. We'll try and get this sorted as quickly as we can. It's the perils of technology.
Yeah, well, sorry about that slight blip, but I think there's my computer's having a bad day. Okay, so we've covered a little bit about the effects that this is going to have on the Mendips, and so we're primarily looking at ways that we can retain some of the benefits that some of these trees provide. Some key trees, these veteran and sort of older ancient trees. So hopefully, you know, we will be able to use these slightly more involved mechanized techniques to retain some of these trees by, you know, monolithing and pollarding. And there are quite a few dependent species, so it would be useful, and particularly where we have other types of habitat within the tree, it would be good to retain all those benefits, particularly with back boosts. But you know, the main loss, I think, will be to animals like, or at least certainly protected species like dormice. So we need to find ways to get back to providing, or to make sure we don't remove some of these linear features such as hedgerows and trees in hedgerows. So this is something that we will have to focus on as time goes on. So in terms of the strategies that we will be looking at, we are looking at natural regeneration rather than just extensive planting, trying not to replicate some of the problems of the past with planting, you know, woodland using too few species or species that haven't arisen locally. The management plan will help to kind of plan for the future, both in terms of what we put there, how we structure it, and, you know, how much is it going to cost? Because obviously with all the costs involved in the actual process of removing the trees, we need to think about ways that we can be creative in sort of making this these replacement woodlands, where it is appropriate to replace woodlands. Obviously, you know, we may find that actually the strategy should be to look at where we can leave open spaces, because that is of higher value, where we've got lots of woodland edge, or maybe where there's secondary woodland on old grassland sites where there may be some potential to restore grassland. But it's diversity which is the key. So biodiversity is absolutely what is under threat currently, and has been for the last, you know, 50 to 100 years. We're looking to obviously increase the numbers of sites where we can have a diverse population of both trees and also habitats. So that should be something that will be more resilient when we're looking at future pests and diseases that will come into the country as human activity causes it to happen anyway, and there's no way we can stop that really. But looking at a way to make sure that ecologically we have more resilient you know, habitats, but also we're looking at ways that actually that can be enriched and connected better. And it is these nature recovery networks which we're focusing on at the moment, Somerset Wildlife Trust particularly, and we need to find how that works together with all of the other land uses around it. So woodland is the cliche, the right tree in the right place. So we still need to be using you know, common sense when putting, you know, whatever species we wish to choose to put back in this location. So this picture to the right is in fact a resistant elm. So that's a new horizon. Now this could be something that we could reuse across our sites, or where is appropriate. And we do need to think, well, firstly, what are local species that would work here, and to get diverse local species, but we might need to look at other more exotic species from different climate areas, or, you know, regions, or you know, the actual areas that they come from will be similar enough to what our climate might be. You know, that's something we need to consider. And we need to consider that long-term vision, because essentially there will be changes both obviously in the next 10 years, both in terms of, as I say, these multiple threats, but also the changes from the climate. But the sort of on the basic front, we're looking at trying to reduce our plastic usage and making sure that these trees can grow. So we need to protect them. So what is next? Well, we may actually be able to identify those which are more at threat, you know, the actual plantation trees, as we know, are actually failing much quicker because they tend to be very undiverse in their genetic makeup. And we do need to look at whether we need to retain something that looks like a woodland in those locations. Like I said, it's very important to consider other options, such as the conversion back to grassland, which we do have at New Road nearby to Draycott, where secondary woodlands has taken over grassland, which is a very high value. I think the main problem with restocking early will be that armillaria, as I've said, honey fungus is actually a very aggressive pathogen, and as it becomes more emboldened and actually gains more energy from the huge number of trees which have died, it will most likely be a threat to our replacement of the trees and the replanting. We may want to restock, but we will have to think about how that fits within the wider framework, the more strategic vision for the whole of the Mendips. So what does this mean for you? Well, certainly for volunteers, if you're not a volunteer currently. We are looking to really bring into play more information so that people can understand what is happening. So both educating those around us and also when we're in reserves, if people are querying what the works are, for us to sort of help you to understand it so that you can help others too, that we can make this a sort of we can sort of roll out to the whole community. We will need to probably explain more when we're doing works, why we're doing it. And as you can see from that image to the right, we do try and provide information where we're having to disrupt people's usage of the reserves. We do need to have more engagement and work with between those who want to volunteer and SWT, and we do want to have more engagement with all the other organisations too. So we're hoping to make it more broad, have more people involved and understand the situation. So we would be looking obviously the practical work, both maybe clearing sites or providing labour for the latter part of this stage. Now, unfortunately, this early stage with managing these trees for risk, it is a very technical job and wouldn't be suitable for volunteers. So unfortunately, volunteers can't be involved in the early stages, but they can be, in the later stages when we're looking at the ecological recovery of our sites. And this includes the sort of more basic maintenance roles. So what is the future management? As discussed, it's really looking at focusing our efforts on those things those trees which are of high risk in the locations which are of high risk where people are, and then looking to retain some features which would be useful both for, whether it's the bats or, invertebrates, and then looking at how we can bring about the recovery of these locations and how we can make them connect better so we don't have a sort of landscape which is separated into smaller units or habitats, and we can look to ways that we can replace these woodlands with something which is of equal if not greater value and of greater resilience. And canopy cover is a concept that's really about protecting land from high rainfall or from events such as climate events, because we do know that canopy provides that interception for rainfall, which would then reduce the likelihood of downstream effects or erosion or and cooling as well. So we do need to look at how we can restore that canopy which is providing those benefits. And there is potential in the future that elms or the environmental land management scheme that is being brought in in around about the mid-decade is going to be something that we can use to restore at a much broader scale. We can look at landscape scale restoration, and that is part of that scheme, so we can work with other landowners. And it is still an issue. The biosecurity issue is still current. We still have outbreaks of other tree pests and diseases such as the oak processionary moth, which last year we saw at least 20 trees with eggs enter the country and be distributed throughout the country. So, and that is a threat to human life as well as a threat to trees. So we need to continue to actually push this agenda. I think both at a local level and at more of a kind of a governmental level as well. So we need to be able to be resourced as SWT to be able to go and actually push that need to governments to make sure that biosecurity measures are in place. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for taking an interest in ash dieback. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer any.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was really interesting. Simon's kicked us off already with a couple of questions. So if anybody else has questions, do please pop them into the chat. Simon has asked, sorry. Simon has asked, are there any common factors linking a variety of tree diseases globally, e.g. global warming?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a commonality that what's happening is global warming leads to not just a change in the temperature, it leads to very sporadic weather that was previously weather could be quite predictable and seasonal, but actually you're getting variation across years and across seasons. And that leads to a change in the soil biota. So you're getting large changes in the behavior of something as basic as mycorrhizal fungi, which Lynn Boddy said, who's a leading was a professor in the field of fungi. She's actually been studying the movements of mycorrhizal fungi, and they're moving north by a number of meters per year. I think she even said it was tens of meters a year. They're actually migrating because of the actual change in the actual climate and the soil temperature, because it's less optimal. And those fungi are absolutely crucial to the health of trees. And if you take out one element in terms of the well-being or the nutrition of a tree, then it can open them up to other diseases. As we've seen, it's sort of web of causality, that triangle that we looked at earlier. It is something that's common across the whole of the world, and we haven't quite got a handle on that yet. And the only way that we can see to potentially manage that is by looking at bringing in other species which can cope with that environment. So it would be geoengineering almost at a level that we don't really understand what the impacts will be, but it is a common theme throughout the world.
Scary stuff. Okay, there's questions are coming in thick and fast now, so thank you everyone. So another question from Simon: is there an opportunity here to reintroduce disease-resistant elm trees at scale?
I think there is. I think it is just the cost though, because we're paying for intellectual property. We're not just grabbing a tree that's within a natural range and just reintroducing it. We're actually taking something that's been engineered. That could open up obviously other possibilities of lack of genetic variation, but it is something that we need to look at, because we have invertebrates which do rely on the elms, which have been endangered for a significant length of time. So I think there is a moss species which particularly depends on it. It's a white streak caterpillar. I think we're looking at the potential from putting it in the mix. Really, as you saw from that image, locally where I am, I've been trying to plant where we can, because it is a component of the countryside that we've been missing for almost 50 years, 40, 50 years, and we need to restore it. So yes, it would be possible, but it would be very expensive, and it would be required to plant larger trees rather than the smaller trees that we're maybe looking at.
Thank you. So we've got two similar questions about the removal of trees and how that affects biosecurity and how that can be done safely.
Well, the biosecurity side of it is, yes, there is an issue with moving wood around, but I believe that that's, the actual ban on the movement of materials. I don't believe that is strictly enforced as it should be, but majority of the infections come from the leaves. So really, it's the movements of that material, and we would really need to be able to sort of keep as much on site as possible, if that is possible, to retain wood on site. But unfortunately, it is one of the problems I haven't discussed, but it is a problem that actually. And I hope that you all understand and probably seen this, but where there is activity such as forestry activity, you get a lot of people who follow that activity and then actually go into the woods and then procure the wood from the woodlands, removing what are essentially, you know, a component of deadwood in that forest. You know, there is the people who are taking wood from the woodland and moving it around for their own sake and actually stealing it, really. And, you know, that is something that we need to bear in mind. And if you do see something like that, where you see, you know, activity which looks suspicious, then I would, you know, urge you to report it, because it is becoming more and more common. We've had lots of trees removed, you know, that have been felled, and they've been felled and left in large pieces, but they've been then moved. But for the most part, we'll try and avoid excessive movement to make sure that biosecurity is kept as tight as possible.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so there's a few questions here about the species, which species are likely to be planted to replace the trees, and also regeneration. So somebody's mentioned that kind of the trees are appear to have healthy multi-stems, and will we be protecting trees as they regenerate?
It's a very good point. I think, you know, going back to the species choice, there is actually quite a wide palette of tree species we can use, you know, whether it's lime, you know, small leaf lime, or, you know, field maple, or, you know, many of those particular, you know, the sort of what are native to this area but marginal, you know, whether it's oak or that the small leaf lime, because, and hawthorn, and, you know, the sort of sorbus species for edge planting, you know, these have very high levels of value within the ecological context, and they do have a lot of dependent species. So essentially, you know, there are lots of options there, and we are looking at, you know, getting as many species as we can, and from diverse sources. But, you know, starting at the regeneration is the best way. Within the process of actually getting a felling license to undertake these works, we need to say what we're going to replace these trees with. And, you know, we would, you know, you can actually see that it is part of a consultation that happens when these works actually happen. We have to actually say what tree species we're going to replace it with, and it's usually sort of like a 20-30% mix of, you know, the oaks and the hawthorns and the, you know, the particularly maples seem to have very little in the way of disease at the moment, so we would be looking at that. And sorry, the second part of the question, I think, you know, we'd be looking at regeneration primarily through the lens of, well, if it can arise in that location, normally it's got an advantage already. Normally you already have an understory of trees in a healthy woodland, and, you know, something like hazel and, you know, hawthorn are already present, so that they can, the trees can grow through there, and they don't necessarily, if we can, the deer level obviously dependent, we can probably allow nature to take its course in certain places, but in others we might need to protect with fencing. So we might need to do areas of fencing to prevent deer getting into that and allow that to grow up. I mean, many of you may be familiar with the Franz Vera sort of theory of how trees arise through, you know, the thickets of blackthorn, and through, you know, the action of, you know, the bramble, where that's actually a natural protection for trees that want to grow and not be sort of browsed. So there could be an element of that, but I'm pretty, you know, what we're going to do, and what is a better way to manage this, is to actually plan for, you know, a density of trees to be planted, and it's normally around about 1100 stems per hectare. Now that is far too high, really, and it would be ideal if we could get the Forestry Commission to bring that down, so that we can then look at restocking with regeneration, and then on the 4th year review, before the actual felling license, restocking license requires you to plant, we can look at it again, see how well it's restocked itself, and then supplementary plant with these other species. That is the ideal for us, I think, and, you know, it's something that many of the landowners are looking at, because it is a naturalistic approach. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. So I'm aware that we're kind of running short of time, so perhaps just a couple more questions. So I think this is relevant to quite a few people, actually, and as the daughter of a woodland owner, I'm quite concerned about this one too. So our private landowners, under any obligation to remove affected trees? And I suppose as part of that, how would they do so safely if they have to?
It's a very good point. No, that's a really good question, because yes, as a woodland owner or a tree owner, even the individual tree owner, you have a duty of care under civil law, really, to ensure that you actually retain your tree or in a safe state, and ensure that you're not imposing a risk, an unnecessary risk on others. And that is true of all landowners, whether it's to do with trees or not to do with trees. It is a duty of care. So in terms of how you manage that, it depends on where that tree is and where that woodland is. And as I said, the location will then determine the outcome and the speed at which you need to respond, and you need to look at the tree health. Now, my first recommendation would be talk to an arboriculturalist or to a woodland manager, or somebody who can be a bit of an independent source of information, who can review or give you a report on the wood and on the tree. And then they will be able to look at where that is and see whether there's a footpath or whether there's a roadway. And they should be able to give you an idea of what risk is involved. And they should be able to tell you then also what the stage of ash dieback it's at. So if it is above 50% functional crown, is it a relatively healthy tree, or is it a really unhealthy tree and imposing a really high risk? But if it's a really unhealthy tree in a backwater with nobody around and no public access, then of course it is less of a priority, but it still probably needs to be considered as a thing, as an activity that needs to happen. They need to fell that tree. So basically my main points are, you have a duty of care. It really depends where the tree is and what the state the tree is in. I would always use an expert witness, or somebody who can give you the information you need to manage that tree well. Because none of the unqualified people are really expert enough to be able to give that opinion, and the Forest Commission do ask that you use an arboriculturalist to give an opinion on a woodland if you need to undertake urgent works. So as a woodland owner, you've got up to 5 cubic meters per any calendar quarter. You can fell that much woodland or that many trees. But if you go beyond that, then you need to be looking at a felling license. So depending on how many trees you have and then what condition they're in and how many you need to remove, then you can make a decision then as to whether you can act straight away or whether you leave it for a little bit longer. But go and ask somebody who can give you a report.
Super, thank you. So I guess we'll ask one more question. I'll sort of combine two here. So there's a question about whether there's been any research into kind of a vaccine or something equivalent for trees, and similarly whether the resistant trees that are growing in Europe, whether there's kind of been much research into using those.
Yeah, that's an interesting, that's a really good question. In terms of vaccines, no, there won't be a vaccine available for this. It's a fungal infection that starts at the tips, and really to get an effective vaccine you need some sort of immune system, and of course the tree just has a more complex way of managing sort of threats and any particular infection. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the fungus affecting the outer part of the canopy, the living part of the canopy, the actual tree can't draw up enough of whatever you might treat it with, antifungals, but you'd then be destroying any natural balance within that tree if you treat it with antifungal sort of treatments. And a bit like a human being, if you unbalance the biota, then you've got a short-term gain for a long-term threat, because that tree is still vulnerable to that disease. It's almost, we need to find those trees which can resist it naturally. In terms of breeding programs, yes, I mean the Danish and the Germans, the Danes particularly, because they've got a similar circumstance, I think they particularly had an interest in breeding resistant trees and finding resistant trees. But I haven't actually got the current up-to-date information on where they are with that. It is something that I know in the UK we're doing an awful lot of, and we're finding various ways to treat the trees, whether it's with phosphites or with biochar in the ground, changing the ground conditions, aerating, or putting mulch down. And there are some methods by which you can reduce the outer part of the canopy of the tree and remove the infected parts. and then remove all the leaves around the tree as well. And you don't get a reinfection that would cause the tree to decline further. So there is an option, but it is incredibly expensive, and it's not necessarily within the budgets of those people who own these trees to actually undertake those works. So we have to look at reasonable responses to reasonable problems. You know, this is not something you can do at a woodland scale. It needs to be done at a local scale. You know, it needs to be something that maybe one landowner does on a remote tree, which isn't anywhere near an infection source. They could potentially do that reduction. And that reduction could be anything like a ½ a metre to a metre down from the outer crown. But that is an incredibly difficult job. I mean, in fact, in one of my presentations, I do have a tree that has had that done, but it's costly, time consuming. And we're still not sure of whether that actually has the intended results at the end. It may just weather the storm though. But I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think we will leave it there. I've saved your chat, and if anybody does have any kind of burning questions, I will do my best to get back to you if you kind of want to email them through to me, and I'll pass them on to Ian or one of our reserve managers. But thank you so much, Ian. That was really fantastic, very enlightening. And I hope everybody else has enjoyed their evening. Lots of people saying thanks in the chat and that they got lots out of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming along.